All right, I'm back from my coffee break. I shouldn't really call it a break. I'm still drinking the coffee. I also just did. You might hear I'm a little out of breath. I just did about 8 push-ups.
While drinking coffee?
Uh, I didn't. Not at the same time. Well, I did. I drank coffee, then I did the push-ups, and then I drank more coffee.
Is this too early for you?
Let's see. Let's see. Do you want to start with Doctor Strange or Quick Draw?
Quick draw. Oh, quick draw. You got something to say about quick draw?
Well, yeah. So you sent me this video. You sent me this link.
I like to send you links.
You do like to send me links. You sent me this link cold to check out called Quick Draw. Full URL quickdraw.withgoogle.com, which describes itself as a game built with machine learning. You draw, and a neural network tries to guess what you're drawing. Of course, it doesn't always work, but the more you play with it, the more it will learn. So you go through it, and it tells me to draw an elbow, and under 20 an elbow. So I am doing a very crude drawing of an arm, and in like 5 seconds, it just guessed that it was an elbow. And then the next one it's asking me to draw is rain, and I'm just drawing a bunch of little lines. It thinks it's a fence. Oh, now it knows it's a rain.
So the purpose of this is what?
So it's kind of demonstrating, I guess, machine learning.
Right.
The general concept that instead of a programmer telling a computer how to operate, the algorithm inputs a bunch of data in order to learn the pattern, as opposed to being explicitly told the pattern itself, right?
Right. So then the neural network gets smarter as it is able to churn through more data.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how fast how I'm just drawing a little swirly gig here, and it just guessed that it was a tornado. That's pretty effective.
Yeah, I played around with this for a while because I was trying to do little experiments with it. On a few passes through it, I tried to make very detailed drawings that were much more detailed than a typical doodle to see if the neural network could still recognize the drawings. And then I did some more experiments with it where I just tried to abstract the drawing out to its barest minimum and see if the network could recognize them.
I'm going to guess it was more effective on the abstracted.
It was, yes. And it was fun trying to figure out for each of these things what actually is the very bare bones thing you need to draw for the neural network to recognize what you're trying to draw.
Right. They had a couple of examples of cat pictures, and it showed you all the examples that people had entered of cats.
Yeah.
And that there's some that if all you do is put in a little nose and whiskers and pointy ears, just those 3 items, it can pick up that it's a cat photo.
But it wasn't as successful at more detailed drawings, which is interesting.
It sort of threw it off. Well, it is a 20-second doodle. So the data that it's trained on are people that are sort of rushing to meet the deadline.
Yep, that's true.
So, hey, do you want to blow through Doctor Strange?
Sure.
I kind of feel like we both saw it recently, so if we don't hit it now, we'll never hit it.
Yeah, we saw a couple of movies recently that we've been offline talking about being interested in seeing. So Doctor Strange is the first one we saw, right?
Yes, and I was particularly interested in how this one was going to go because it was the first Marvel Cinematic Universe movie that I saw going into it knowing it was part of the Marvel Universe. I had seen Guardians of the Galaxy before, but in my experience, that was just kind of a one-off. But now I knew that this was part of the greater universe, and we had talked about the MCU before.
Right.
So, and you had talked about your interest in comic books, and this was kind of MCU has been a bit of a renaissance for the comic book genre. I was also intrigued by Doctor Strange just from my own fluffy perspective. Doctor Strange brings up some interesting notions from the otherworldly. So I was interested to see how they would take on that.
Were you familiar with the comic?
In general, yes.
In general, okay.
I could not have given a senior level thesis on it, but I could tell you who Doctor Strange was. And
right, okay.
Yeah, I was down with Doctor Strange. I was cool with him. I didn't know all the details of his origin.
Yeah.
But I knew he was essentially a mystical, magic wielder kind of dude.
Right. So what did you think?
Overall, I really enjoyed it.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic actually in terms of what it was trying to be. I think you had mentioned to me originally that these Marvel movies, they're not trying to be ultra deep movies.
That's right. But they're a lot of fun, though, I think, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, like we had talked about before how a lot of these fantasy adventure movies struggle to find this balance between lighthearted romping adventure and a more serious gravitas, and how the Star Wars and Star Trek and Marvel franchises all approach this a little differently.
Yeah.
I thought this one had an excellent balance between a dramatic adventure with a lot of humor. In particular, I thought they set that out well with how. Oh, we should probably mention this is like major spoiler territory, yeah.
If you want to go there, sure.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I need to. But we should talk about what a spoiler is later on. Well, actually, let me pause and tangent there. How spoiler free do you prefer to be going into a movie?
Um, I usually like to be fairly spoiler free, but for some things, that's just impossible. Like for Star Wars, I want to know everything ahead of time.
Really?
I can't resist. As soon as it shows up on the internet, I want to look at it.
Really?
Yeah.
So like with Rogue One, any little bit of news, you're like hopping all over that.
I can't help myself. I can't resist. Yeah. but for other things that aren't as up there on the nerd scale, I'm more content to just ignore it and wait till I see the movie.
Huh. Well, let me ask you this: like, how extreme are you willing to go? If somebody leaked the entire script of Rogue One online, would you read it?
Huh. No, I wouldn't read it No, I wouldn't read it. That would probably require a bit more effort than I'd be willing to do. If some screenshots from the movie were prominently displayed on a website, I wouldn't avert my gaze. But to actually go read a script, that's probably that's a bridge too far, I think.
What if there was one brief Reddit post of top 10 plot spoilers from Rogue One? And it just listed out like, oh, this character dies, this person falls in love with this person, Darth Vader dances the hula dance, like whatever it was. Would you want all of that information, know everything that's happening ahead of time?
No. I think I would consume spoilers up into the moment that the thing is out in the public, and then I would shut down at that point.
Although that's become more of an issue though in the last several years. There was a pretty famous spoiler with the second recent Star Trek. What's the name of it? With Benedict Cumberbatch, who also plays Doctor Strange here.
Star Trek Into Darkness.
Yes. We're going to have to reinsert a spoiler that we're spoiling about a half a dozen movies here. So Into Darkness, there was a newsworthy spoiler that the villain was Khan. And that was a big rumor on the internet. And J.J. Abrams famously denied it flatly.
Yeah.
And then it came out that it was Khan, and then people got upset that he denied it. And he's like, look, this is kind of uncharted territory here. Like, it's almost impossible to keep these things under wraps. Like, I remember people getting really upset that some people had spoiled. Here comes another spoiler, everybody. That people had spoiled Han Solo getting killed at the end of Force Awakens, and just like drive-by spoilers, right? So it's like,
that's just mean.
Yeah, seriously.
It's one thing to take it into your own hands and look for things that are spoilers. It's another thing for someone to just blurt it out in front of you just to spoil your enjoyment.
Yeah, so to me that would be like the most extreme end of spoiling. A slightly less extreme would be reading about leaked information, just about plot elements online. And maybe a slightly less intense, but still spoiling would be to read a review. Like if you went out and read a newspaper/online review of a movie, you're going to get a certain amount of spoilage. But there's kind of a convention not to spoil the big reveals or the endings, right?
Yeah.
And spoiling can come in multiple fashions. It's not just what's going to happen in the movie. It's how good is this movie? So I talked to Brother X about this quite a bit because he does not like to know anything about Star Wars movies going in ahead of time.
Cool.
And in particular, he gets upset if people tell him whether it was good or whether it was not good. Like he doesn't want his his expectations prejudiced.
Right. Yeah, I can see that.
And it's one of those things. Once the cat's out of the bag, once the horse has left the barn, you can't really undo what has been done. Like so like with Rogue One, and I don't even know if we want to mention this here because I don't want to let the cat out of the bag for our listeners potentially, but
Oh, this will be out after Rogue One is out.
oh yeah?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
This recording is not going to be published in the next 2 weeks. I guarantee it.
We have the long draw editing process here.
Yes.
Too big.
In fact, if it's probably going to be months since Rogue One's come out before anyone listens to this, if at all.
So Tom, decades ago when Rogue One came out,
exactly. Now you're more in the ballpark of when this is actually going to be consumed by humans.
do you think we'll be alive on these podcasts, or is this more for posterity?
I'm working in the long term here. This is for this is on the macro scale here.
Wow. Okay. Then I could sort of mention. So there's been chatter back and forth about whether the production of Rogue One is in trouble or not in terms of its tenor.
They did reshoots on it.
Yeah, and so simply hearing that a film did reshoots got people up in arms, right? They're like, "Oh my gosh, it's in trouble." But if you dig a little deeper, it's not uncommon for a movie to have reshoots.
That's right. It's very actually for large productions like this, it's very common.
Yeah. Plus, if you were to go back and say which movies had which level of reshoot, and then what was the resulting quality of the movie, there's not a direct correlation. Like there are movies that have not had reshoots that have been great and terrible, and there's movies that have had ton of reshoots that have been great and terrible. So it just creates this unknown. And the other issue that's going on with Rogue One and how this all emerges is that the Disney management of the Star Wars franchise is kind of an unknown thing going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone assumes that they paid quite a bit of money for the franchise.
Billions,
yeah. So everyone assumes that they're going to stoke the movies for as much as possible. They want universal access as much as possible. They're going to be building up a huge section of their park in Florida dedicated to Star Wars. Lots of merchandising, etc. So how willing are they going to be to allow a creative director to sort of take a movie and make it in its own way, or is this all going to have the Mickey Mouse Disney stamp on it?
Yeah.
So with Rogue One, the commentary was it was this great kind of dark, edgy character piece, and Disney didn't like it, and so they whitewashed it in terms of its theme. Anyway, that's a lot of backdrop to just walking in and watching a movie.
Yes.
Right? So that could really alter your experience. So I thought it was interesting with Doctor Strange here because other than knowing it was Benedict Cumberbatch, who I like from Sherlock and other things, I went into this one with relatively low relatively low spoilage. Whereas with Arrival, that we'll talk about in a little bit, major spoilage because we both read the short story before.
Right.
So that being said, I really enjoyed it. I thought the getting back to the humor gravitas balance, the thing that I thought was really cool that they did that gave me the sense of they're approaching this the right way is so the backdrop is that we have this Westerner who's all full of himself, right? Who's got the big ego,
right?
And then he has the moment of tragedy,
the fall from grace.
Yep, fall from. So this is a classic fall from grace sort of. What do you call this? A trope, a pattern, whatever word I'm searching for. And then in this particular take on it, it's the classic, the Westerner who has disheartened and searching for answers goes and finds his answers in the East, right? And so the Eastern perspective broadens his horizon. This is Homer eating the chili pepper and seeing the coyote. And so his first encounter with the guru, with the teacher there,
the ancient one.
So they could have played that in the classic, Neo meets Morpheus, forget everything you know. In fact, I think they use that phrase, forget everything you know.
Yeah.
I would be fascinated to hear about how they evolved this script because right before he walks in the door, he's talking to one of the accolades of the Ancient One who says, forget everything you know. And it's got this real gravitas to it, right? And the conversation that goes on between Doctor Strange and the Ancient One, it very much tries to blow that whole thing up. Like, like she shows him a picture of the chakras, and she shows him a picture of the acupuncture points.
Yep.
And he's like, "Oh yeah, I've seen pictures of that in a gift shop." So it's like right out there. He's like saying, "Oh, you're trying to do this East meets West, tropey thing. Like, yeah, I'm having none of that. I've seen the movies." And so then she okay, and then she completely breaks your preconception of what the strong presence guru should be, and she has that great sequence of where she knocks him on his spiritual keister and sends him flying through the universe. I thought that was pretty cool.
Good. I mean, that film is fairly typical of the other MCU movies. I mean, they pretty much have a formula down for these, where they can produce something that's lighthearted but has a lot of good action and good characters. So, if you like Doctor Strange, you'd like pretty much most of the other MCU movies.
Yeah, totally. Guardians of the Galaxy version 2 coming out this year, right?
Yeah.
I shouldn't say this year. It's probably 2050 by the time this podcast hits the airwaves. Tom, yes. What plus C level do you think it's going to be by the time the podcast hits?
At least +4, +6.
All right. A few other minor notes on the movie I wanted to get your take on. So I thought it was notable that there was not one gun in the entire movie.
Yeah, you're right. I think you're right. Yeah.
So for a modern action movie, very, very notable. So I imagine that had to be intentional, right? So it's like they're trying to do this magic thing and kind of this Eastern, it wasn't quite martial arts, but, more physical combat. And they completely avoided the guns. I thought was cool. Did you see it in 3D?
I did not see it in 3D. I hate 3D movies.
Really?
Yeah. I find it way too distracting.
So I typically agree with you. Most of the movies I've seen in 3D, like far greater than 50%, I've found bothersome. And I know part of that is that just visually, I don't like too much sensory overload. In fact, just seeing the trailer for some unrelated movie, after like 30 seconds, I had to close my eyes. I'm like, so I know I don't have a strong visual appetite for such things, but there have been a couple of exceptions. I thought the 3D in, what's the name of the movie? With the dude on the planet, and he's...
Avatar?
Yes. Dude, your machine learning of my mental doodle was quite good.
The man on the planet, Avatar.
That's really good, Tom. Yes. So I thought the reason why I like the 3D in Avatar is that instead of having things come out at you primarily, where it used 3D for depth, where it felt like the screen stopped at the screen, but that there was a depth to it. And I thought the 3D.
Yeah, actually, when you mentioned that brings to mind the one 3D film that I've seen that I actually thought was successful was Gravity.
Okay.
Have you seen that?
I've seen Gravity. I did not see it in 3D.
Because in the 3D version, when you look into space, I mean, the star field is basically at infinity, and you really get a sense of that watching the 3D version, which I thought was effective.
Nice. Yeah. So I think for certain landscapes, if they approach it effectively, it can be a nice enhancement. So the only reason I bring it up here is that I saw in several reviews that people said the 3D, particularly for those physical fractal altering action scenes, was particularly effective. The other thing I missed in Doctor Strange, and only heard about this when I read a couple of reviews, is that apparently, I don't know if this is a Marvel thing, that once the credits roll, they add a couple of extra scenes at the end?
Yes, they do. You didn't stay for that?
Oh, those sneaky guys.
Yeah, that's a tradition for all of them. There's always at least one or two scenes, either in the middle of the credits or at the very end. And this film had both.
What a great way to make you stay for the credits.
Right, that's right.
So there's a little extra scene with Thor, I think?
That's right. So basically setting up the next Thor movie.
Right.
Which is going to apparently include Doctor Strange in it.
Excellent. So you liked it?
Yeah, I liked it. I mean, there was nothing to expect more than a fun time.
Did you get anything philosophical out of it?
I don't think so. Was I supposed to?
So, I mean, I didn't think it was a deep philosophical exploration, nor was it meant to be. But like any of these sort of takes, it at least provides something to gnaw on in terms of, like the basic notion it was exploring is that this in philosophy they would call it reductionism, which is everything can be reduced to a physical explanation.
Yeah.
And so the counter to that is that no, there are things like consciousness which defy a purely physical explanation, and we need different ideas for that. So I like that. There's a philosopher I really like, current American. His name is Thomas Nagel, and he wrote a famous essay in the 70s called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" where he explores the nature of consciousness and essentially refutes the reductionist take. So I kind of like that. I like the notion that there are exploring the possibility that just because we have not yet experienced every dimension of consciousness, we shouldn't make the mistake that those dimensions don't exist. Like we shouldn't by the same token make the assumption that they exist, but we shouldn't discount them either. That's what I liked about that.
Okay. But it's going to be I mean, I don't really know much about Eastern mysticism or anything like that, but I would expect that this was a very, very comic book version of a lot of that.
Yes, in terms of like techniques. Like I don't think there's books you can read that where you can open portals. I mean, who knows? Actually, there's so they brought up the chakra image, right?
Yeah.
So apparently in Eastern mysticism, there is one of those 7 or 8, I think there's 7, one of those 7 points that's associated with the Sanskrit term is siddhi, Siddhi, essentially powers. So like ESP, astral projection, all the sort of enhanced ability stuff that they were messing around with in the movie. There are some Eastern practices that focus on that specifically. Like there's a particular yoga called Kundalini yoga, which is directed at trying to access this latent energy. And then there's other practices that very specifically and consciously skip over that point in its emphasis, under the idea that your goal is not to sort of mess around with these capacities, but is to expand your consciousness further on, not to lose yourself in playing around with the fun stuff.
So, as someone who probably takes this stuff a lot more seriously than I do, you weren't bothered by having some of these things just trivialized into a superpower type of thing?
No, not at all. I think I like any kind of exploration of these ideas, and anytime we start thinking about these things and what they could mean, and we have to start somewhere, And so I don't think every exploration of consciousness or feeling or non-reductionism has to be some pure academic exercise.
Okay.
For example, I don't know if you saw the Pixar movie Inside Out.
I have not seen that, no.
So I think you. Oh, I don't know. I think you would enjoy it, but I have no idea. So basically, that was a take where they have the main character's internal emotions represented by different characters.
Right.
And most of the movie takes place inside the main character's mind. And so they explore notions of attention control and also memory. And if you take its representation of memory literally, it's actually a bit misleading in terms of how memory works. They have a very kind of photographic storage model representation of memory, where a lot of recent research in cognitive science goes against this intuitive idea that when I remember something, I have a specific. It's like I'm a computer, right? I'm specifically retrieving an image, and that I just call up that image. Where most recent research in cognitive science is leading to this notion of every memory is reconstructed dynamically every time. So that was a good example where it was certainly not academically accurate, but it's at least exploring this idea of the subconscious, and that there are different motivations that act upon our attention, which we can then work on to achieve a greater level of self-control. I mean, they didn't say it like that in the movie, but they explored the idea.
Yeah.
I like any movie that just explores those kinds of ideas,
So speaking of exploring ideas,
yes.
The other movie we saw recently was Arrival.
Yes, we did.
And we had talked about this offline before, wanting to see this because it sounded interesting to both of us. In preparation for this movie, we did consume some spoilers by reading the novella that the movie is based upon.
Dude, some spoilers.
A lot of spoilers.
I think we pretty much spoiled the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. It kind of did change how you would view the whole movie if you know right up front what's going on.
Yes. I sort of assumed that most of the core reveal would have already been revealed in the short story. Yeah, I definitely approached it with that awareness of, okay, I'm going into this thing and I already kind of know it. So it actually left me wondering towards the end whether I would have had a markedly different experience of enjoyment had I not known anything about it. I think I would have had a lot more of a visceral reaction of wonder and awe at the big reveal
Hmm.
had I done that. But that being said, I rather enjoyed it. How did you like it overall?
I thought it was a better than average sci-fi movie in the sense that it dealt with interesting ideas. I mean, that's what I like about sci-fi is exploring different ideas rather
Right.
than just the spaceships and aliens and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally.
And in that aspect, it was better than average. I thought it did a good job of actually translating the original source material to film. I was initially very skeptical that that could have been done without dumbing it down a lot, but I think they pulled it off reasonably well.
I totally agree with you. I was really surprised how well they were able to achieve that. And I think it could have gone really annoyingly wrong too. And they really sort of balanced on the edge of that. I mean, just to give our listeners a sense, I mean, they used terms like semisiographic and nonlinear orthography and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I mean, it could have felt like you were sitting in a linguistics lecture,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But they did an excellent job, I thought, of maintaining a focus on the emotional story of the protagonist and on the overall suspense of the narrative. So yeah, I was pretty impressed with how they did that.
Do we need to have a kind of explanation of what this all is all about for the benefit of the listener who hasn't seen it? And
Yeah, so like thumbnail sketch of Arrival is that aliens have come down in these 12 majorly huge pods across the world, and we try and communicate with them. Essentially, I kind of think of it in the genre of Close Encounters.
it's the first contact genre.
Yeah, like so in Close Encounters, they eventually try and communicate through a series of musical notes,
Right.
and in Contact, I think it was like more mathematically, like prime number kind of pattern recognition.
Yep.
So the protagonist of this movie is a linguist, and there's certainly a backdrop of working against the clock because these pods are scattered across the globe, and so Russia is approaching this in a different way than China and the U.S. and it's causing a political crisis in the globe. And so before we sort of lose control of the situation, can we find out why they are here, and how do we
Right.
go about that when you have a completely foreign consciousness that you're trying to engage with?
Yeah, the main idea being explored here in both the movie and the original novella is what's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. How would you describe it? Um,
How you so there's like the strong version and the weak version. The strong version is your language determines how you think,
and how you view reality and how you view your existence.
right? How you think about time. And so the weaker version would just be that it influences or strongly influences you.
Yeah, and this seems to be an idea that has come in and out of fashion within linguistics in the 20th century. And this story is kind of taking that to the next level and examining what would happen in this situation where an alien species came to Earth and we encountered these issues of learning a alien language rather than a different foreign human language.
Right, right. And so all the assumptions there. Yeah, so the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, this is a really interesting idea. So you could think, like they mentioned in the movie, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. If you can only express with a certain level of vocabulary, then you can only say those things. So they were talking about how the Chinese may have been trying to communicate to the aliens via mahjong tiles, which is a combative game. And so if you're only asking questions in a combative mindset, then you're only going to get answers out of that. Or the vocabulary of the construct sort of determines.
And the main protagonist in the story is the character's name is Louise, what is it, Brooks?
Hmm.
Louise Brooks, who is a linguist and specializes in all kinds of languages. So she's tasked with trying to lay the groundwork of communication between humanity and this alien species.
Yeah. So I kind of think of like the action of the narrative as more just supporting the exploration of this idea.
Right.
They definitely hyped up the political instability in order to make it a more suspenseful movie.
Yeah, that was completely absent from the original story, I believe.
Yeah, which is fine, I think. I mean, otherwise, that was the real danger in trying to translate this story, is that you just have a dry academic exploration of a concept.
I would have enjoyed that, but that's what I was afraid of, as far as it diluting the stuff in the story that was interesting to translate it into a mass market movie. But I still think they did a good job. Although I saw this a week after it opened, and basically I was sitting in an empty theater, so maybe it's not going to do very well at the box office.
Oh, the critical reviews have been fairly positive so far. I liked the whole pacing of the movie. It was certainly fine with having these sort of quieter, deliberate scenes. Like, it didn't feel rushed. I thought it did a really nice job with the music and the sort of overall cinematography of making the aliens just feel alien, just totally foreign. There was really neat monolith imagery. I mean, it was hard not to see the connection between 2001, right, with the monolith, and they have this nice shot as we're being introduced to Louise of the monolith of the university building. There's just many floors, and then you contrast that with the monolith of the alien ships. That was pretty cool. When they're initially flying out to meet the aliens, or rather right after they pick up Louise. So Louise is the linguist, and then the other character is a theoretical physicist. And they're in the helicopter, and they're talking about how we're going to approach talking to the aliens. And she says something along the lines of that language is the foundation of human civilization. And the theoretical physicist says, no, science is the foundation of human civilization. And I thought that was really cool, because most of these movies, if they're going to set up a science versus something else balance, it's always science versus religion, or science versus emotion, or science versus feeling, or
like in Doctor Strange.
Yeah, or like in I don't know if you saw the movie Twister. There's a tornado chasers where, well, one of them is very data analytical driven and the others are very intuition emotion driven. That's usually the dynamic that is set up in these things, right? But language versus science, I can't think of another film that sets up that kind of dynamic. It was very evocative to me as well of the opening scene in not the opening scene, the helicopter fly-in scene with Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, and they're talking about how they're going to approach these dinosaurs and chaos versus pure analysis. And so as soon as they sort of set that language versus science, okay, this is a different kind of movie. I was totally eating up the whole thing. I think I liked it a lot better than you did, Tom. I'm getting the sense. You thought it was a little bit above average.
Yeah. I mean, I think I had the kind of the same reaction to this as I did to the movie The Martian. Have you seen that?
No.
Because that's a movie I read the book first and then saw the movie. And the movie does a reasonably good job of translating what's interesting about the book, but it's very watered down. I think I enjoyed reading the novella of this more than actually seeing the movie. And I enjoyed reading The Martian more than the movie, although The Martian wasn't particularly well written, I don't think. But it had a lot of interesting ideas in it. And the novella, I think, has it's pretty dense as far as the number of interesting ideas.
Oh, definitely. The first time I read the novella, The Story of My Life by Ted Chiang, yeah, my head hurt. Like,
it's the story of your life, not the story of my life.
I'm sorry, Story of Your Life. Okay. Oh, that's right, because she is telling the story to her daughter as she goes along.
Exactly.
Yeah, I found myself having to pause every other page and look up a word on the internet when I was reading Story of My Life, which was great. Like, so Ted Chiang, this is his first Story of My Life, Story of Your Life. So this is his first collection of short stories, apparently. I read a couple of the other entries there. They were also very, very good. Have you read the rest of the?
No, this is the only one I sampled out of the book that he did.
But yeah, so he's a recent sci-fi author and a really great example of, I guess you would call it cerebral sci-fi versus pulp sci-fi. I mean, both of which I like, but yeah, he's a really, if you're looking for a thinking person's exploration of sci-fi. The other thing that he does really well in his stories, at least the first 2 or 3 that I've read, that I think this movie also did very well, is being able to explore this kind of big idea in a not dumbed down way, and yet still have an emotional pull through it. It's not that when I explore a conceptual idea like this, I need to have the emotion, but as you're experiencing somebody else's exploration of an idea, I think it's almost like it just greases the wheels of your experience. It's so easy to connect into an emotional narrative that if you allow yourself to be pulled along by it, it can sometimes make the process of understanding the more cerebral concept easier. I find, right? Like if you completely pulled out the emotional connection that Louise has in the story, either in the novella or the movie, I think it's harder to connect with the understanding of what they're trying to say.
Yeah, I mean that whole side story of her and her daughter is basically the whole point of exploring the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in the first place.
Right.
Circling back to spoilers again, did you were you disappointed to have read the story ahead of time?
So I think it's two different kinds of experiences. Like, so I went into this movie. So this is the other funny thing about this movie is that this is the first movie I've seen by myself since like high school.
Really?
Yeah. So I like typically I'll go to the movies with my wife and kids, and this one I wanted to get done seeing before we recorded this morning, and we had a very very busy weekend, and so the only time I could find to see it was by myself, and also not everybody in our family had particular interest in this. Right. So, and I used to review movies very briefly for my high school newspaper. So there were a couple of times when I went by myself. So this is the first time I'd been to a movie by myself in quite a long time. So decades. And I had a little notebook. So I was like, you know what? I've already spoiled the movie for myself by reading the novella. I'm just going to go completely disconnected objective on this experience, right? I'm diving in with both feet forward. So I'm seeing it by myself. I had read the book before. I had read reviews about it before. So I went as spoil rich as I could possibly go. And I took notes during the movie. So all that being said, from that perspective, it was rich. From the actual visceral experience of like, OMG, she's remembering the future. Like, right. I didn't have any of that because I knew it was coming.
Yeah, and that's like the very first scenes in the movie is her memories of the future.
Right, and you're like, oh, okay. So,
but you wouldn't realize that until like very late in the movie if you're going in unspoiled.
Yes, and so as a result, I don't feel like either of us can comment on how effective they executed the progressive reveal of that core element of the movie, because we already knew it was coming. Although I did want to ask you, and I know with mass-marketed movies, when they use this pattern, this trope, the progressive reveal is a very common pattern in movies, right? Not just sci-fi, but...
Right, yeah.
And so when they get to the apotheosis of this progressive reveal, she's actually in the room with the alien, and the alien's talking to her, and the alien says, Louise sees future. Weapon opens time. And I'm like, did you have to spell it out like that?
I think you do, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I guess if you're going to do that, you should at least give the audience the chance to catch on to it by themselves, which I'm guessing that this movie did. But again, I can't comment on that because I already knew it.
Yeah, right.
I also wanted to ask you if you thought that the final ending of, there was going to be this big political upheaval, but it died down. And then there's this scene at the UN and everybody's happy and humanity's united. And did you think that was too sappy?
You mean the whole business with the cell phone, you mean?
Well, not necessarily the business with the cell phone, but the fact that end result of this is that Louise has translated the universal language that the aliens have given us. And now that we have this universal language, all the tribes can talk to each other and everybody's having champagne and cocktails at the UN.
Yeah, that warrants another story beyond this. I mean, what would happen to this world if because of our understanding of this new language, we can see things non-linearly?
Right.
That would probably be a major disruptor of how things work in this world. And that just basically is left hanging at the end of this film.
Yes. In fact, there is a crucial distinction between how we see time versus seeing the future that they didn't really distinguish between. So, for example, in exploring this idea a little bit, I found a story about a tribe in Papua New Guinea, very isolated from the rest of the world. And their concept of time is nonlinear. But when I say concept of time, I mean how they physically think of time. So we think of time as going from left to right. At least in the West, that's how we think about it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how native speakers who write in a language that goes up and down maybe think of that. But at least in this Papua New Guinea example, apparently historically their ancestors had come from the sea and traveled upland towards the source of this river.
Hmm.
And so they think of time as going uphill. And so when they talk about the past or they refer to the past, they point behind themselves. And when they talk about the future or refer to the future, they're pointing ahead. But
Hmm.
but so okay, so that's really interesting. But they're not perceiving the future, as far as we know. Those are just
Right.
human beings who have a different physical representation of time. They just have a different, metaphor for talking about time. Whereas in the movie, we're saying is this language is such a fundamental different way to describe how the base mechanism of the universe is operating that you can actually remember the future. And so if once you go to there, then you open up all sorts of paradoxes, which, the basic question is, well, if I can remember the future, can I change it?
Yeah. Then you're living in a deterministic universe.
That is a much bigger thread to pull out about fate and free will and determinism. And that's what I love about these movies, that they just raise these ideas, right? There is a sentence at the very end where Louise is asking the theoretical physicist who you see is going to become her husband. She says, if you could see your whole life start to finish, would you change anything? And he gives kind of a non-committal, yeah, I guess I'd express my feelings a little bit better. And my initial reaction to that was like, OMG, absolutely. Like, I mean, honestly, I have a mountain of regret in terms of lost potential of time. So I would change
Hmm.
a billion things about how I've executed my portion of the show. I don't know how you felt about that line, Tom. If you could see your entire life, would you start altering items? If you could see the whole thing start to finish.
Yeah. Right. Probably right from the get go.
What, like you would crawl around in a different way? What do you mean?
Exactly. Right from first grade, I'd start doing things differently. So, what did you think of the basic idea that I was exploring here, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis? Do you think that sounds plausible to you? That our understanding of language shapes our understanding of the world around us?
So, yes, absolutely, 100%. I can't completely articulate what I mean by that, but I'm going to use that as an example of what I mean, which is, have you ever just had a realization or a feeling and you just couldn't find the words to express it? And I don't just mean like you're searching for a word, but some real important realization or feeling. And maybe you're trying to communicate something in an emotional discourse with somebody who you're close to, or a technical epiphany you've had to a work associate, or something else. And there's just no construct or terminology in order to express that. You've had this experience?
I have, yeah. I think most people would.
So to me, what that experience is you're having a feeling you're having a thought in its kind of pure form, and you're trying to actualize this thought in some kind of expressive medium. And as soon as you choose an expressive medium, you are immediately bound by its rules. Like the simplest rule, you're bound by its vocabulary. Like
Right.
I can't talk to you in English without using the words of English. And I can't speak anything other than English words. If I do, then I've exceeded the bounds of that particular medium and I'm not talking English anymore. Which is why I think when you try and stretch the bounds of articulating a thought, those words become harder and harder to come by, particularly if you're trying to express a new perspective or a new thing that you have discovered. But then there's also the structure. Like we have these assumptions in our brain. Like when I'm talking to Tom, there's an assumption that I'm going to make a statement, and then you are going to reflect on that statement, and then you're going to tell me other statements that you reflect. So we have these modes that are already built in.
Yeah.
And that's limiting the awareness that I can express to you. It's always going to be this imperfect me talking out of my fishbowl, writing some limited expression of it, and then you interpreting that limited expression in order to try and achieve a similar state of consciousness. And so it's this problem. And I think human beings over time try and evolve these languages. And so for the mundane realizations of where is my sugar bowl and pass me that enchilada, language can be very effective. But once you start to push the bounds of abstraction, it can be very difficult. And so you need new language and new terms. And so the notion that like we could be given a language that would fundamentally alter how we think about the universe, that would help us articulate thoughts that we never were able to articulate before, I think is pretty compelling.
Well, that brings up an interesting idea, because after I saw this movie, sci-fi is successful to me when it prompts me to do further explorations and different ideas. And after seeing Arrival, I spent yesterday afternoon basically down the rabbit hole of Wikipedia reading about linguistic relativity and all kinds of other related topics. And I started exploring the world of constructed languages. Have you ever read any stuff about that?
Vaguely familiar, but I could not speak to it.
What we're speaking is a natural language that's evolved over time. But there are all other things like constructed languages, the most famous being like Esperanto, that are invented basically to achieve a particular purpose. And there's been languages that have been created for the specific purpose of exploring the idea of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, whether a language constructed a certain way can make you think a certain way. And I kind of stumbled upon the language called Lojban yesterday.
Lojban?
Have you ever heard of that?
No, I've never heard of Lojban.
You'll like this.
Okay.
It's a refinement of an earlier language called Loglan that was developed in the 50s, but then Lojban was developed and admitted started in the 80s, and it's designed to be a logical language and to encourage logical thinking on the behalf of the speaker.
Interesting.
Its main goal is to remove any ambiguity in language. Like in English, we have lots of words that are spelt the same but have different meanings. We have words that sound the same but are spelt differently. We have words that sound the same, that are spelt the same, but they have different meanings in different contexts. And Lojban, that's all removed. There's only one way to say certain ideas, and there can be no way of misinterpreting your meaning if you speak the language correctly.
There's a hugely interesting rabbit hole in the terms of the philosophy of language, which it sounds like your Wikipedia rabbit hole is certainly circling around people like Nietzsche and Wittgenstein and all them. So one problem, though, even outside of the philosophy of language itself, that philosophers struggle with is that it's kind of like this experience I was describing before, where they feel a clear, far-ranging realization, and then they try and communicate it. And the only language that they have often is a very abstract structural language. And it's like, okay, what is the pragmatic utility of a linguistic expression if only half a dozen people on the planet can understand it, right? Like, if you ever want just like a visceral example without even trying to get into it, just take an example of some Hegel. Like he's known for being one of the most dense, abstract writers. And I'm not saying anything about the relative value or truth of Hegel. I think he has a lot to offer, but it's this notion of language is only a means to an end for communication, right? And so it's who you're trying to communicate to. The form that you take should be sort of contoured to your audience. Do you think of music as a language?
I do, yes, most definitely.
In that it's always expressing emotion, or that it's just an alternative language for...
It expresses different concepts than what a normal natural language would convey, but it still is able to communicate, I think.
Okay, if music is a language, is music expressing thought?
I suppose sometimes it could. But I think more often it would be more evocative of emotion or emotive thinking.
So here's my conjecture, because I would agree with you. My conjecture is that when we say thought and thinking, and we try and think of an example of thought or thinking, the first example we think of is thought expressed in the English language or whatever languages that we natively speak.
Right.
So I had a thought that Hegel is obtuse. But what I'm really referring to there is the expression of that thought, the form that that thought manifested in that language. And I mean, anybody who does translations or speaks multiple languages knows
Hmm.
as soon as you get beyond the mundane of I have a rock in my hand or anything as soon as you start to get abstract and you start to try and express a higher level concept in a language, there's not a one-to-one unambiguous translation from language to language.
That's right. Yeah.
And so that example, and that's why Google Translate, even though it's getting really good these days with machine learning and other things, it's not a trivial problem. So that example alone should show us that the thought that is being expressed is different than the expression that results, right? And so if we sort of decouple this notion that a thought is a phrasing in a spoken language, then we can think of a thought as being expressed in any sort of context or medium. Music can be expression of thought, or the way I react to a family member in terms of my physical motions or my emotional reactions can be expression of a thought. And so if you think of this as getting more and more and more abstract, there could be ways in which we are thinking, and yet we're still so in the nascent stages of being able to express our thoughts that we're not even aware that we have these levels of abstract thought. You know what I mean? It's like we haven't developed a language yet in order to be able to articulate an expression to then become aware that we actually have those thoughts.
Yeah. It certainly makes me want to start learning more languages.
So you confuse yourself more?
No, because to just be able to open up different parts of your thought process, just to see things differently.
And to me, this all gets back to one of the first concepts you brought up of when we were talking about tribalism.
Yeah.
I mean, tribes have different terminology, different languages, not just, English versus French versus Chinese, but different ways of thinking about the world.
But I really do wish I was fluent in more than one language. I think that probably has great benefits to someone. That's something I would like to talk about to Brother X more in depth. Because, I mean, he grew up in the U.S. like us, but he spent basically almost entire adult life living in Japan, and he's fluent in Japanese.
Right.
That's got to be a real change to your whole thinking, I would think. I mean, that's a language that's completely different as far as how it's written and as how it's speaking than what we're used to.
Yep. Yeah. He would have a lot of practical experience to bear on this topic.
Have you spoken to him about that?
I mentioned this movie to him, and I told him he should check it out. So we've had talks about language before. Tom, I kind of feel like if there's going to be an interview on Two Bit Geeks, it's going to be with Brother X first. I kind of feel like he's going to make the first guest appearance.
Yeah, that might be inevitable.
I mean, how many? We've referred to him several times now. So
yeah,
at least we'll have one listener.
Hopefully.
Thank you, Brother X.
Thank you. Thank you for sticking with us through all this blather.
I do wonder how knowing programming languages has affected the way I think. I'm not really conscious of that.
Because those are languages. Those are very structured languages.
Absolutely.
And in fact, Lojban is also one of the purposes of Lojban is to be machine parsable. So it could be appropriate for use in communicating with AIs, whereas using English leaves a lot of ambiguity that an AI would have to decode. Whereas using a language, a constructed language like Lojban, would be a lot easier to facilitate communication.
Yes. In fact, when I got my computer science degree, one of my classes was in the construction of language, and there's evolving and constant debate within computer programming about what constitutes good code, what clean code is, and how you ought to code. It's basically saying, how ought you to speak in this language in such a way that others can understand it and it can be maintainable and that you can extend upon it without it breaking. And yeah, so it's interesting. On the one hand, computer languages obviously are very unforgiving in that if you break the syntax, it won't compile. So you're not you have to follow the rules. On the other hand, there's a lot of freedom in terms of how you put it all together. So,
What's your favorite programming language?
I'm gonna really show my nicheness here. I love ActionScript.
Mm-hmm.
However, that's just because I've had experience with it. Like, I've had the opportunity to really explore it in depth, right? And so I feel very comfortable with, like we were saying before. I feel like there's a pretty direct connection between what I want to think in the language and then its expression. I feel like I can get pretty close.
Being fluent in ActionScript, has it changed the way you think about logistical problems, or how to solve problems, how to structure things?
Not consciously in the real world. It's not like I'm, fixing a flat tire and I'm like, hey, ActionScript. but it is interesting. Again, talking about tribalism, where I'll be reading threads about problems in other programming languages that people are trying to solve, because every language has its own quirks and strengths and weaknesses. And so what is a effortless thing for one language is a real hard problem in another language, just because of the way it's constructed. And so right now I'm trying to evolve my primary language from ActionScript to JavaScript, pretty much because the Flash player is on its way out, dying a slow death of 1,000 paper cuts. Poor Flash player. So sad. Anyway, so JavaScript is solving these problems, and I just kind of laugh and shake my head sometimes, because some of those problems ActionScript is just beautiful for. And yet JavaScript has some things that ActionScript would be very clunky for. And so
Right.
I think, so in terms of getting back to what you said about the benefit of learning multiple languages, you're talking about spoken languages, but I think when you experience the strengths and weaknesses of one perspective and then you adopt a second, it can be very easy to kind of bring that in.
Yeah.
That's how we should change the world, Tom. Everybody should learn more languages.
Yeah, I agree with that.
When I think of different languages that I would ever like to learn, I find myself motivated just purely on the aesthetics. Like, I like the sound of Gaelic. I also like the sound of Danish. So that just the pure ornamental value.
I'm interested in learning LaunchBand now too. You should really take a look at that, because it's kind of structured more like a programming language. It's obviously invented by computer programmers.
Right.
So you probably get a kick out of it.
Cool. LaunchBand. I wonder if I could do LaunchBand, and what would be like the opposite of LaunchBand? It would be like the language of pure logic and the language of like pure feeling. The language of the heart, Tom.
Oh, God.
It's probably too late to talk about the difference between feeling and emotion.
Yeah, let's slip that into this episode as well. You have been listening to 2-Bit Geeks. If you'd like to support the show, please leave us a review on iTunes. With more reviews, it will be easier for new listeners to find us. Thanks for your support.
Mita Brafola Lorjman I Ehuro der Rejbi Hola Hoga 2-Bit Geeks Ga Preshravi Kuho Tezu Hitu Halonu Shasnu Roshindri Elo Prichau Elo Se Chalbogi Hering Alonu Pensi